Okay, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Julian Pepperell. Julian is an independent fisheries scientist. He's a marine fisheries scientist. He has authored over 120 peer-reviewed publications. He's written hundreds and hundreds of articles for popular science magazines. And
fishing magazines.
Popular fishing magazines specifically. And yeah, you worked for New South Wales Fisheries for 15 years and then became an independent fisheries consultant. And Julian's particular area of expertise is open ocean fish. And if you want to know anything about marlin, sailfish, spearfish, or swordfish in particular, but really any open ocean fish, Julian is sort of the person to talk to about that. So yeah, his presentation today is Arrows on Maps, 5 decades of angler-driven gamefish tagging in Australia, which is a quite remarkable effort, which I'm sure he'll talk more about, but they're going to be tagging their 500,000th fish. So
they just have.
They've done it. So Julian's been doing this for 50.
No. Well, I'll get into it.
He'll talk about it.
I'll show you when I started.
It's quite amazing, and the biological sampling up and down the east coast of pelagic fish, marlin and sailfish. You know, if people need samples from Australia for genetic population studies worldwide, they come to Julian. So it's great to have him here. He's on the steering committee for the FRDC Billfish project that we're kicking off up here, tagging sailfish and black marlin in NT waters to find out more about their movement ecology, which Matt Hammond, PhD student here, is heading up. So with that, I'll leave it to Julian. You've got a mic there, so I'll keep this one. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Keller. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come up. I haven't been to Darwin for quite a while. I love the place, and it's great to see Keller here, who was one of my old PhD students from way back when he was at another Charles Sturt University, and he worked on striped marlin, as you probably all know, and a long way from the coast, so he did a lot of travelling too. But we've kept in touch ever since, and I'm glad to see him back in the billfish arena after all this time. So I want to talk about this program that I have been involved with for, it seems like my whole life, but not quite. And it's a kind of success story of a citizen science project that we hear a lot about, citizen science, and the word had never been invented at this stage, but that's exactly what this is. So without further ado, I don't think that's going to...
Oh, need to click on the mouse.
Yeah, just click on anywhere on the session and it should go, and you should go.
No.
Yeah,
okay.
Now the arrow should work.
Right. Will it work on the arrows now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this program, if you have not familiar with it, it started in December 1973, believe it or not. It's funded by New South Wales Fisheries, but it's Australia-wide. New South Wales Fisheries DPI. They funded it out of consolidated revenue until the saltwater fishing licence came into New South Wales. I think that was in around about the late 1990s. And since then, the funding of the program comes out of the money raised from saltwater licences in New South Wales. And even though it is Australia-wide and always has been Australia-wide, so anybody tagging fish outside of New South Wales is using money from the saltwater fishing licence in New South Wales. It's just a historical accident in some ways. At the time the program started, the Director of Fisheries in New South Wales wrote to all of the other directors and said, would you mind if tags were used in your state, because these fish are highly migratory or highly mobile? And at the time, all the ministers said yes, and they've never said no ever since, but there are a few complications come into it. But no, it's good to have it so widespread too, because the fish are not recognising state boundaries or international boundaries for that matter. Oh, God. Okay. These are the sort of original objectives of the program. Originally, it wasn't really expected, I don't think, to generate a lot of good science, but it has, and I'll go into that more. So that, obviously, if you tag a fish and it's recaptured somewhere else, we get information on the movements of those individual fish and over years migrations. Stock structure and mixing rates of these fish is very important. They occur, most of these species occur right over ocean basins, that sort of scale. Are they separate stocks on different sides of those oceans or not? We can get growth rates if you tag a small fish and it's recaptured some years later. I might say when these fish are tagged all by recreational anglers, the size of them is estimated usually, not usually measured, which is potentially an issue with accurate growth rates. But in fact, we have over the years got really great information on growth rates of species like southern bluefin tuna, for example. If they're tagged at a small size, and that would be about 4 kilograms, recaptured maybe 10 years later at a size of 100 kilograms, well, that's that fish. We know that individual fish grew that much. This is a simple equipment. You're all familiar with tags probably. These tags were developed, that dart tag up the top was developed in the United States in the 1950s by a guy called Charles Mather III. He worked at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and he thought he might distribute these tags to recreational anglers in the Atlantic to tag Atlantic bluefin tuna and white marlin. And it was successful. They tagged a fairly small number, and some of them were recaptured. And so the US government decided to pick up on this and had programs going on either side of the United States and in Hawaii. And it's very simple equipment. This tag here is a Billfish tag, which is more recent. And this was developed again in Florida to anchor in the muscle of billfish in particular. And it's sort of made of surgical grade nylon, and you've got less biological activity associated with the head. And when the person tags a fish, this card is filled in. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later on. And that card is sent off to the New South Wales Department post-paid. And that data is all entered onto a central database. So this is the trajectory of the program. Keller asked me where I started. I started right here, actually. My second year, the director of fisheries called me into his office, and I was working on other species at the time and of recreational importance. And he said, I'd like you to take over this little tagging program we've got going. And because he'd been lobbied by the game fishing industry or association in New South Wales. And I sort of said to him in my naivety, I said, you know what, I'm really busy. I don't think I've got the time. And he said, I think you might have misunderstood me. That was not a request. And sort of serendipitously, it's been part of my whole life ever since. So we decided at this period to try and increase the number of fish being tagged, of course. It was modelled on the American system where they had quite a lot of fish tagged. And there was a fair bit of resistance to tagging fish in those days. Amongst that particular fisheries sector, they thought catching big fish and weighing them was how you did game fishing. And but you know, it picked up, and we encouraged them. We encouraged competitions to see which club would tag the most fish and give trophies and awards. And pretty soon it became the resistance turned into complete acceptance to the extent that, you know, by about this stage, there was very few game fishing boats would go to sea without tags on board, and the tagging side of the competitions became much more prestigious than the capture side. That's still the case. I mean, in tournaments these days around Australia, well over 95% of billfish would be tagged and released. But there is a residual capture component. People will take a fish, and it's not illegal to take them, and they're perfectly edible. And we also utilise those as well. So that's the history of the whole program, and these peaks and troughs I'll talk a little bit more about too over the years, which with such a long timeline of a fishery, it's unusual to have such good catch data. So as we just mentioned, the 500,000th fish was just tagged recently on this project, on this program, and all of that data is stored on one database. 9,200 recaptures. Looks like not a huge recapture rate, but some species are much higher than others. And this is a breakdown of the species groups or individual species. So billfish and tuna take up the lion's share. And the lion's share of billfish is black marlin. We've had something like 85,000 black marlin tagged on the program. And the main tunas tagged would be yellowfin and southern bluefin tuna. And yellowtail kingfish are tagged in quite large numbers, and that species has by far the highest recapture rate. Something like 8% are recaptured. And some more stats, over 60,000 individual anglers have tagged fish and put their name on those cards, getting up towards 12,000 boats. And really, I found this surprising, 950 fishing clubs. And not everybody's a member of fishing clubs either. A lot of these fish are tagged on charter boats, and but in the organised fishery, it's quite surprising how it's completely an integral part of this fishery. To put it into perspective worldwide, I mentioned the US programs that started up in the 50s and adopted in the 60s, and you can see that all these programs have had a long history. And just to highlight that ours is the biggest in the world, which we're quite proud of. But until last week, I would have told you that all of these programs are still going, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Except I was a bit disappointed to find out that this particular program had decided to, pull down the curtain on that program. They figured that it had run its race. So, but the others are all going strong, and people want to tag fish. I guess that's the thing. Here's some records. The long distances moved are quite impressive, but of course they're the exception to the rule. But they still makes quite an impressive list. This little black marlin was tagged at an estimated size of 15 kilograms and was recaptured at Costa Rica, right across the Pacific 4 years later. Big swim. The blue marlin went from Sydney to south of Sri Lanka, so it must have wound its way through the Indonesian islands. And in contrast, the striped marlin, there's 3 species of marlin in the Indo-Pacific, much less. In fact, this record here was only set last year. After 45 years, that's the longest, by far the longest distance recorded by a tagged striped marlin. And again, this project that Keller mentioned, we're concentrating on sailfish and black marlin in the top end. Sailfish are particularly important. This is a recent record as well. Sailfish also, and I've got some other material to show you, are not very big movers. So it shows the contrast between different species. And this is Times at Liberty. So you can see that the school shark holds that record by far. I think that school shark was recaptured pretty close to where it was tagged. I won't go through those in any detail, but you see that the tags sometimes stay in fish a long time. These tags do get rejected, we know that. Like a splinter, works its way out. If it's not put in, even if it is put in properly, it'll still release from the fish, or the fish will reject it. But I want to make the point that in some of these, quite a few of these species, a lot of the recaptures are made 1 year or multiples of 1 year after release in pretty well exactly the same place. So there's a lot of evidence now that's building up that there's this phylopatry takes place. They're coming back to where they came from on an annual basis. They don't just disperse well, they seem to disperse randomly, but at least some fish do come back to the same place. And case in point was this sailfish, almost exactly 7 years after it was tagged off Broome in Western Australia. It was recaptured 3 nautical miles from where it was released. So, and it may well have come back every year, we don't know. So this program has taken a long time to build up the sort of information we have. This is what we knew about the long distance movements of black marlin in the 1970s. We had a few interesting recaptures. We knew from tagging in the Atlantic in particular that, eventually we would hopefully get some longer distance movements, but nobody had ever tagged black marlin before really, so we didn't know what they were going to do. This is what happened in the 1980s. We started to get more recaptures, especially from village fishermen actually around New Guinea and Solomon Islands, and some longer distance long lining fleets from Japan. And then bang, we got a lot of recaptures. Well, there was increasing numbers of fish being tagged, of course. And this is the Costa Rican fish. This one is a mistake, actually, is an error. That was actually recaptured about here. So this is still by far the longest distance, but a few others being recaptured through the Philippines and Indonesia. So giving the impression of that this is a single stock through the whole Pacific. And the next decade, a few more recaptures. You see the one that moved from Exmouth over to India. So we're starting to get more tagging going on in Western Australia. And then a few more over there the next decade. And that's the picture we get. So it turns out genetically, we've had genetics done more recently. It looks like there's one single stock in the southern southwestern Pacific, a separate genetic stock in the Indian Ocean, and a separate stock up in the northern Pacific. Just in contrast, I mentioned striped marlin don't move much. That's over the same period of time, that's the long distance movements of all striped marlin tagged and recaptured. So quite a remarkable difference in two species that are quite closely related. And just to emphasize that again, this is distance moved over time at liberty for the full billfish species, plotted on the same axes. Obviously, if we stretch the sailfish out, you'd see more, more movements around here. But that just shows that a lot of black marlin have been recaptured after more than 500 nautical miles from where they were tagged. Hardly any sailfish, hardly any striped marlin, and not a lot of blue marlin tagged, but again, probably like black marlin, much more mobile. And you can see this long tail of recaptures of sailfish pretty well where they were tagged after long periods of time. And again, very few striped marlin recaptured after 1 year. And we don't think that's because they die after 1 year. We think it's probably because they reject the tags more than the other three billfish species. So it's not just about recaptures though. This program, like I said, there's 500,000 records of fish being released in this program. And the tag card up again. And this information goes into the database. Obviously the species, the size, either estimated or measured. And of course the date and the position. So they used to write in the early days just the position, and now with GPS we get much better accurate positions of release, and that all goes into a database, and we've been mining that data for quite a while now, 40 or 50 years of data. So we get long-term catch series, which I've mentioned, look at catch composition through time, how that might change, size distribution from the estimated sizes on the tag cards over a long period of time, and yeah, and the influence of environmental variables. Well, this is where it's been very productive to look at the changes in the peaks and troughs. So here's a very jagged graph of the numbers of juvenile black marlin that have been tagged on the program. And incredible differences, from here to here in just a couple of years. And when I say juveniles, it's 0+. These are in their first year of life. There's very small black marlin ranging from maybe 5 kilograms, maybe this big, up to about 30 kilograms. They're incredibly fast growing. They'll reach 25 kilos in 1 year of hatching from a little larva the size of a pinhead. So what causes these? Why are there such big fluctuations in recruitment over the years? There must be reasons behind that. And so different projects have crunched the numbers into models. So species composition through time, that shows just the 3 marlin species off Eastern Australia, and shows used to be all black marlin, and then striped marlin became much more prevalent in the 90s. And we think partly because they became more available to the fishery. There may have been a decadal scale abundance kind of increase in abundance of that species, but also the fishery worked out how to catch them more efficiently as well. And the fishery certainly learned how to catch blue marlin, the green wedges, better as well, because basically they started to catch blue marlin when they got bigger boats and went further offshore, where blue marlin are much more oceanic than the other two. So it's pretty unusual to have that sort of length of data to see what's happened in the fishery. And I mentioned size distribution. Well, these are estimated sizes of sailfish off Broome over quite a long period. And you can see little recruitments come in, pulses of small fish, and different years will have different sizes. And so you can plot growth rates from these modal progressions and that sort of thing. Now, I mentioned some studies being done on environmental aspects and causes of the movements sorry, the abundance of the fish. These are honours projects. That was very interesting. This is a sailfish project that looked at sailfish catches over the years off northern Queensland, and he found that they were probably correlated more with good years were correlated more with floods and you're used to that up here with the wets and the fisheries. Well, it turns out that sailfish probably feed a lot more when there's nutrients washing out because they're much more coastal than the other billfish. And the other example is the study of black marlin, where all the positions of black marlin releases were plotted, and the preferred habitat of those was sort of back cast. So in other words, you'd take this point and say, what was the temperature, what was the chlorophyll levels, what was the sea height, things like that, current direction, and then put all that into a model and come up with the preferred habitat of black marlin based on where those fish were released over that period of time, and then come up with maps of preferred habitat of black marlin. So this is sort of where the real data comes from, which is coastal, and then the imagined data comes from looking at where the preferred habitat and where it wasn't preferred might have been. And that study actually showed that the preferred habitat of black marlin had moved south at a rate of 88 kilometres a decade over the last 3 decades, presumably due to climate change. But you've got to be confused because the study actually got quite a lot of publicity, and the headlines became black marlin are moving south, but they're not. They're still being caught where they were, and yet their preferred habitat is moving further south. So whether the marlin will eventually catch up to their preferred habitat, or whether they're adapting to slightly warmer conditions and staying where they were, we don't know, but we will know. This program used to get, in the early days, quite a lot of criticism from other scientists around the place saying, look, it's a waste of time. You can't expect recreational anglers to, do this properly and keep decent data you've got to have scientists and technicians going out doing this sort of work. Anyway, 40 plus years later, we've got hundreds of different publications that have come by using this data. The data is freely available to institutions, not just in Australia, but around the world. They just apply for a data license agreement to the department in New South Wales. And I've done this many times, and the data's given, and with the proviso that they get a report back on how the data's been used. And it has been used a lot in stock assessments and genetic studies and all sorts of applications that we never dreamed of when this program started. That's just like 2 pages of 10 pages. Okay, so the citizen science aspect has led to other things. The thing with getting recreational anglers involved in projects is that they get used to the science, and they get used to information that they're really interested in coming from the science. And so that's been tapped into in a number of ways. Tournaments in New South Wales, we've now got 30 years of catch per unit effort data from tournaments. At a tournament, we know how many boats fish, how many days they fish, where they fish, and they report that over the radio for their own purposes. We tap into that and get this great catch per unit effort series. We also get to go to the tournaments and sample the landed catch for all sorts of research purposes. And like I said, 95% of marlin are now released. So by asking the fishermen to take fin clips from the released fish for the genetic studies, they have cooperated really well in that. And in fact, I had another PhD student, Sam Williams, just do a really terrific study on the genetics of black marlin using mainly fin clips from recreational caught fish. This is just what happens at tournaments. As I say, the few fish that do come in get well and truly looked over. He's a much younger Kellerkopf in his days of cutting open marlin and looking at what sex they were and getting fin spines for aging them. There's a parasite group from the University of Adelaide, and this is Jock Young from CSIRO, so the fish get well and truly studied. And here's some more recent 2 PhD students from different universities, Macquarie Uni and Griffith. She's studying olfaction and eyesight in sharks and billfish, and she's taking tissue samples to look at microplastics and pollutants. And here's Sam Williams with a couple of bags of containing fin clips that were handed into him at the same tournament. So it's all good stuff. Okay, so I just want to spend another maybe 10 minutes talking about another little pet project that came into my mind quite a long time ago when I started to look at these arrows and think, and you know, we would get back these letters all the time. Nowadays, it's probably mostly email, but they still get letters. And these letters, a lot of them handwritten from village fishermen in PNG or Vanuatu or somewhere, Costa Rica. And you know, I used to think, well, you know, who are those people? How important are marlin to them? I mean, we know marlin are kind of like the pinnacle fish in Australia. Why did they send the tag back? And I just got curious, and it was a good excuse to want to go and to travel to some unusual places. And so using this information that where those fish had been caught, and also, this is not my photo, but a game fisherman I knew in PNG, he travelled to this fairly remote village in Milne Bay in far eastern Papua New Guinea, and he sent me these photos of these guys who not only caught marlin, obviously, but each of the fishermen had their own tree, and they had a competition going amongst themselves to see how many tails they could put on the tree. And I got to go there. I got to find out what's going on. And so I did. I was lucky enough to jump on this is my first trip, a game fishing boat, going from Port Moresby right around to Lae, including the eastern tip. And I found these marlin fishermen everywhere we went. We'd call in and ask them if they'd caught marlin and show them pictures. But yeah, you know, I've caught plenty of them. So this is Rodney with his marlin boat at the back, and met a lot of these guys and very knowledgeable about the different species. This is in Alatau, right on the eastern tip of PNG. We put out a radio announcement we had some names of people who had returned tags from there. And this lovely man turned up his net. He wrote this letter, that's his name, Gao Holika. And he just turned up and came down to see us on the boat. I showed him this on the computer that we had his letter. He'd caught this 15 years before, and he was amazed that there was still a lot of interest in, and he showed me how he caught the fish by paddling, and they catch little live bait and put it out the back, and he put a loop around his paddle, and as he paddled, it would move the bait back and forth. And they were targeting these fish. They were targeting marlin, but also, but they did, one constant story we got here and in other places was, yeah, marlin were really important to catch. They were big fish, plenty of food, but they were also very dangerous. So I found this guy through a doctor who we were talking to. He said, he listened to what we were talking about, and he said, he said, the guy came in here 10 years ago, and he'd been speared straight through his chest by one of these billfish. And so one thing led to another, and I went to his village and we asked with an interpreter, where's the guy who was speared by a billfish? They said, oh, he lives in that house over there. So he came out all bewildered, and his name is Danny Arthur. And yeah, he'd been sitting in his canoe and he'd hooked a sailfish. It was a sailfish. I showed him the picture, and the line had gone slack, and all of a sudden the fish had jumped out, went straight through under his right arm and straight out his chest the other side. And taking him straight out of the canoe into the water. He told me this, he's telling you the story. and the fish is still stuck through him, and he somehow got rid of the fish by pushing it off him. He doesn't remember how. Climbed back into his canoe, figured he was going to die, and lay down. And two of his friends in canoes saw that he wasn't sitting upright, so they went over and he was gasping for air. It took 4 hours to get back to the local little hospital at Alatau, and this Australian humanitarian doctor saved his life by pumping him full of penicillin and all sorts of antibiotics. And he said he figured that the bill must have brushed his heart aside as it went through to the other side. And sorry. And it turns out that this was a real fear of the canoe fishermen, or to other places we went to as well, that they are dangerous, and they've got to be really careful. Another place. There's four places. I've travelled to lots of places. It's going to be a book one day, you see, so I'm just giving you a very early plug before the book's even been written. Taiwan, I found out about this billfish fishery in Taiwan. They harpoon the marlin over there. The rougher the better, because the marlin come up to the surface. Incredible men that incredibly agile, skillful, and passionate. This whole town is called Chenggong. If you ever go to Taiwan, go to Chenggong. It's the greatest place if you like fish. Every afternoon, all the different boats come in and unload huge quantities of fish. It's on the edge of the Kurashio current that comes down from Japan. No, it goes up towards Japan, full of life and full of billfish. And they even have a billfish festival, which I thought was pretty good. Once a year, and they have parades. They've got a billfish temple, and they eat billfish all week. It's sort of like a dream come true for me. And this is just a catch of some harpooned black marlin on the day I was there, or I was there for about a week. And every day they would come in. And the fishermen themselves are just like game fishermen in Australia. They're competitive. So this is the leaderboard for the champion harpooner in Chenggong for the Marlin Festival. And so this is the heaviest marlin for the week. And these are aggregate totals of the weight. They look after their fish really well. They ice them straight away. They get big money for them. And when you do look after fish, turns out they're delicious to eat. They're not regarded as all that great eating in Australia because people don't treat them like this. They can get, sort of quite strong flavour and a bit dry. But no, they're a pinnacle eating fish, as well as obviously a prestigious fish to catch. And there's two of the harpoon guys. They all like drinking beer, and this guy was the champion harpoon fisherman of the year, Captain Chen. And the interesting thing about these two guys is that they had both lost the top joint of their right thumb through getting it tangled in a rope after they'd harpooned the marlin. So they were in a pretty exclusive club. They're hard men, and it's a dying thing though. There's not too many younger guys that are sort of taking up the harpoon. So I mentioned a recapture in Sri Lanka. I tracked down the man who sent that tag back and went over and visited him. This is the boat that he caught the marlin that was tagged in Australia. He goes out for a week at a time with 3 other guys, just eating fish they catch, does it pretty tough. He took me down to local markets, and again, there's huge numbers of pelagic fish being caught. Vast numbers of boats, unlimited, not unregulated, really largely unregulated fishery. So it must be incredibly productive waters there too. But this is a blue marlin, there's sailfish in amongst there. So that's where some of our tag fish go. And he turned around, and this is the T-shirt that he was sent as a reward for recapturing the marlin and sending it back to New South Wales. So he still had that after a couple of years. And so I gave him a bunch of fishing line and hooks and lures, and he was pretty pleased. And India, we got notification of this recaptured black marlin from this lady who was Director of Fisheries in Pondicherry State in southeast Tamil Nadu in India. And this is the newspaper article she showed me at the time. And this is the tag marlin because it had an Australian address on it. this is the Minister for Fisheries from Pondicherry, and this is her, she was Director of Fisheries. And so I found her and had a wonderful couple of days with her showing me around and talking about marlin. So different cultures, different fish. And also also in India, this guy is a billfish biologist who I sort of found through the literature. We went to a number of fishing ports and jumped down the holds of some of these boats to look at the billfish catches. I must say this particular hold was quite an experience. I had to come up for air because the whole hold was like full of ammonia from all the sharks that were also sort of in the hold. And sharks, you know, have this ammonia in their blood, and it was really toxic almost, you know. And Indonesia, not far from here. This is quite a recent trip. I was lucky enough to be in Makassar markets. This is on Sulawesi, and looking for stories about big black marlin. I was interested in whether they spawn in this area. So I was asking about, you know, what's the biggest marlin and everything. And you know, somebody was waving through the crowd, and we pushed our way through. And this big black marlin had just been landed from a little sort of like a taxi boat that had been from the bigger boat and brought it in. And it turned out this man here he'd been working in the markets for 30 years. He said it was the biggest marlin they'd ever seen in the market. So it was lucky that we were there at the time. And it is a black marlin that was, well, I wasn't allowed to cut it open, but I would say it was probably gravid. Blue marlin up in Kendari, another part of Indonesia. And this is actually Bali. There's a commercial fishing port called Benoa. And this was a boat that was unloading frozen fish, a longliner that had been fishing off Australia, actually, in other areas. And it was in the second day of a 3-day unload from an 8-month fishing trip. And it was incredible, the number of fish that were coming off it. We didn't get very many, we don't get too many tags back from Indonesian longliners, but we get some. And that was just to prove I was there. Got to have your picture taken with a big fish. And lastly, this is my most recent trip to the island of Yonaguni, which probably not too many people would know where that was, but there's a string of islands that runs off the southern tip of Japan down towards Taiwan, called the Ryukyu Islands, again in the Kuroshio Current. And there's a fishery on this little tiny island of Yonaguni. It's postage stamp, population of about 1,200 people, and they target marlin, blue marlin and black marlin by trolling. That's trolling a lure or a bait through the water, usually a single man operating this boat. I'd heard about this through a Japanese scientist who did all of his research through going to this island, and he's published the definitive papers on the growth rates and diets of blue and black marlin by sampling their catch at this island. And so we were lucky enough to charter this man. His name's Captain Ichi Chitoshi, and he was very keen. He's apparently the gun marlin fisherman. And this guy, Rick would know, is John Diplock from an old friend of mine from fisheries. He accompanied me on all these trips because he loves carrying my bags for me, he reckons. We didn't catch a marlin that day, unfortunately, but he was a lovely, incredible guy to fish with. And his father actually was a harpoon marlin fisherman too. So we got some great stories from him. He didn't catch one that day, but this was the marlin he caught the day before that he showed us. Again, really beautifully looked after. And lastly, he invited us to his house, and this happened quite a lot. You know, we were invited to their houses to eat and drink with them and hear their stories about marlin. And this scene reminds me a little bit of sort of my office and the paraphernalia that's associated with a lifetime of marlin, and just an example of the stories that that I got from going to the other ends of the arrows. So that's it for the talk. And just thanks to all those involved, especially the people who tagged the fish and the people who recaptured the fish. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. That was wonderful. Does anyone want to kick it off with questions?
You listed a bunch of other tagging programs.
Yeah.
Have you seen like the reciprocal presentations or summaries that each of those tagging programs put
Not
out?
really.
Is there much interaction, you know?
Yeah, not really. I mean, in the Atlantic, of course, there's a lot of countries that catch tuna and billfish and return tags. They do put out annual reports, and we put out annual reports on this program. But no, nothing like this. I think it's just my obsession with, and me being involved for so long in the
And a big
program.
overview. Because it's the overviews that's the wonderful thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. You know, that's where I think they fall down a bit. A lot of this data has not been used in other areas to the extent it is here. I think possibly because not many people know it's there, and sometimes the people who run the programs are like technicians, not fisheries scientists, and sometimes the programs are run more for PR than
Anything
you know.
else?
But yeah, I mean, having said that, that's might be a bit unkind. I mean, the data are there, and it you know, the newsletters are available, and I guess some people do use it for. I mean, it is used in comparison. I didn't mention that because these days the little cheap plastic tags have been superseded to some extent by incredibly expensive, you know, satellite tags that are not communicating with the satellite all the time, but are data loggers. You stick that on the back of a marlin, you jab it in similarly, and then you hope that the tag pops off that fish after a predetermined time, maybe 6 months later, hopefully, something like that. And then it will relay data on every 30 seconds of depth, temperature, and light level, which will give you a geographic movement of the fish. Trouble with those tags is that they cost about, well, anything up to $10,000 each. So when you stick one of those tags on, it's like throwing a very expensive laptop overboard, and you don't hear back from every tag. And quite often they'll come off prematurely. So they'll come off after, you know, a week or 2 weeks, which is, you don't get much information. But yeah, these, you know, much cheaper, but much more widespread programs are still going, and they still are giving us this long-term information. So the short-term information you get from the pop-up tags is very useful. It tells you what the fish are doing vertically as well as horizontally, but only for a short time. And that won't tell you much about the mixing of stocks or anything like that. But whenever a stock assessment's done on these fish where we've got this sort of data, this is the first data that the stock assessment people want to know, and the stock delineation people. You know, the arrows are very important to know, well, you know, is this mixing happening or not? Yeah.
Any other questions?
I noticed on the graph there wasn't hardly any fish tagged from this area. Does that mean there's not many tagged, or hasn't been the recaptures?
Yeah, good. Actually, good observation, Jason. Not many fish tagged, actually. That's one of the things that's happening with this project that Keller's got going. Is to it's a kind of a developmental program to. There is a emerging fishery, if you like. There's a lot more interest now in billfish being caught in, especially just off Darwin. But there is quite a lot being tagged in the Gulf, though, Groot Island and off Weipa. There's quite a lot of sailfish and billfish action there. We think that the fish are out there, but it's just a matter of the population, number of people who, you know, are going to catch those. And, you know, they're not always targeting billfish. I mean, targeting billfish in Australia is more fishing for fun than food. But if you've got Spanish mackerel that you could catch and, you know, other nice edible fish, you're probably going to target them more than you'll target a marlin or a sailfish. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But yeah. But you know, we hope that that you know, fishermen will take part in this project. That part of it is to encourage them to cooperate by helping with putting satellite tags on these fish, but also by taking fin clips from sailfish and black marlin, and also by hopefully keeping little juvenile ones. So you do get very small little black marlin out here, which would only be like a couple of months old. And if we get a few of those, you tell how old they are by getting their otoliths, and they lay down a ring every day. So you can count the number of rings every day, you get the daily age. It's a very accurate way of aging small fish. And we have aged a few of them from up here already, and we need a lot more. But what I like about it is it will tell you the birth date of that fish, because you can back calculate from, the day it was caught, how old it was. So it was born on, the 4th of December 2019 or something. Not born, but hatched anyway. But it's kind of quite neat. But important to know, because people want to know, if they see a small fish, does that mean they were spawned in this area or not? We don't know the spawning grounds of these fish in this area at all. We have no idea, which is surprising considering how the Japanese have been fishing for them for like 60 or 70 years. So there's still a lot of questions. Yeah.
Another question?
I can just add a bit to answer Jason's question. When this program started in the 70s, the population of Darwin was somewhere like 35,000, right? It's just the number of people who are out there to tag fish. The other aspect of it, in the 1980s, NT Fisheries actually had a program to go and look for marlin.
Did they?
An exploratory program to try and foster a game fishing industry.
And here we are today.
Yeah, it worked. It worked.
Yeah, first of all, I think I've seen a similar presentation a little while ago. Just equally fascinating. In fact, probably more fascinating this time around. More, yeah. But one of the questions I'm absolutely intrigued by the what's at the other end of the arrow. Being involved in the NT tagging program and hearing traditional owners ringing up and saying, I caught a tagged fish, and telling the story. It's always absolutely fascinating. But I wonder, you've had an opportunity to give that feedback now to the recreational fishers about what's at the other end of the arrow. And there's obviously a lot of cultural difference between this sort of reverence in the recreational fishery to look after, tag, conserve billfish. And then on the other end, it's from everything from subsistence fishing to artisanal harpooning to, factory long lining with big freezers. What's the kind of feedback you've had from the recreational fishers who are doing the tagging as to what's happening at the other end of the arrow?
Yeah, well, I mean, they love it. They're really interested in it. Never thought about it much, and then it just puts a face to these other people catching fish at the other end, and they're not surprised that the subsistence fishermen are not particularly interested in the prestige, although there is prestige. And one of the villages I went to in New Guinea, I've got to tell you, one of the questions I always ask the fishermen is, what's the biggest marlin you've ever caught, if they've caught marlin? And the answer from the village fisherman is always, it was bigger than my canoe. And that's what I'm going to call my book, Bigger Than My Canoe. And so there will be full of exactly what you're saying, full of the stories from those different angles. And I think there is this pervading feeling amongst fishermen in general, and even the general public who see a billfish. There is something kind of a bit special about it compared to, maybe this is my bias, but they're a beautiful looking thing, and that seems to be, appreciated through, other cultures as well. Yeah, I guess that's the answer. Yeah.
You mentioned even in the NT, billfish are totem.
Yes. Yes, it's yeah.
Which I had.
Yeah. My sister, her name's Jenny Isaacs. She's written many books on Aboriginal culture and history. One on Tiwi Islands, which is a beautiful book, fabulous book. And yeah, she found some bark paintings from Yirrkala, which is Nullarbor, I think, with sailfish on them. And it turns out that it is a totem in that area. And Elcho Island is another area where it's a totem, apparently. And I've got a bark painting from Elcho with a marlin on it. So yes, I mean that hasn't really been teased out much, I don't think, about the cultural significance of these fish. But I think that the name for this fish I'll get it wrong, but it was on Elcho, it was something like galoop, and the idea was that was the sound the fish made when it jumped out of the water. It splashed. Yeah.
Anyone else have questions in person or online? If people have questions online, go ahead and shout out or put something on the chat board.
I was just going to ask if you had any more travel destinations to go to.
You know, I have one more. I've got to write this book sometime before I die. I've been doing it for about 12 years now, I think. Before COVID, I had a trip booked to Japan, to mainland Japan, where I was going to attend a game fishing tournament over there, which would be very similar but different, you know, from Australia. But the main reason for going to was I found a guy online who's a Japanese game fishing guru, and he had caught his 1,000th marlin, and that was his ambition in life. And you know, I'd followed him on Facebook for a while, and so I communicated with him, and he invited me to Tokyo to stay with him, and also to visit his a marlin museum. And so I think that'll be the pinnacle of my life, will be to see this marlin museum, which is his own collection of billfish paraphernalia from everywhere, from absolute kitsch to, you know, gold statues and bronze medallions. And so I think that'll sort of complete the cycle, and then I'll be able to die happy, I think. I have my own collection of marlin kitsch, and I intend to make a donation to his museum.
So, Julian, you talked before about bigger than my canoe and the citizen science angle. Have you ever found that fish have shrunk from when they were released until where they were catched based on the estimates of who caught it?
Yeah, you know, that's a very important question. It is. Not very often, believe it or not, but we've had some massive shrinkages, which have turned out to be, that can't be right, you know, so you check back, and in fact, they've made a mistake with 2 cards on the one day or something like that, and that can happen, you get errors. It's very embarrassing if that happens to fishermen. So there's always a chance that they might get a fish recaptured, and I know with charter captains, they always they write down a number less than what they think it was. So maybe we get a, you know, an exaggerated growth estimate on some of those fish. Yeah. Yes, it reminds me of my one, I'll tell a joke. Did you hear about the one-armed fisherman? He caught a fish this big.
Well, Julian, I might add to your answer there. Is I had to break the news to a former, rather prominent Australian cricketer who's now involved in the fishing industry and has his own radio show,
Yeah.
that one of his fish had shrunk. And I made a mistake of doing that when he interviewed me for his radio show. That's the last time that he spoke to
me. Pay out. Facebook's cruel, I tell you.
Killer.
All right.
One more.
Colton.
I'm just curious because you mentioned out the other programs, especially in the southwest of the US, we haven't caught any marlin going with the current because of that. Largely, that current goes east. So we've tagged fish here that have gone across.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that fish that have been caught over there are coming this way?
Yeah, good question. Not many, but there was 2 that were caught in New Zealand. No, that's wrong. They were caught, there was one that was caught in New Zealand that was tagged off California, and that was a black marlin. And then there was another fish that was tagged not on the coast of, but where was that tagged off? Near Hawaii, and it was recaptured on New South Wales coast. So there has been some movement back the other way.
I'm just curious if the arrows go the other way.
There is a little risk with some of that data in that there's misidentification of the fish. The black and blue marlin do look pretty similar, and sometimes they're misnamed. And I did uncover one case like that where they said a black marlin had travelled to Australia, but I actually went and saw the cast of the fish, and it was a blue marlin. So, you know, unless that had happened, it would be in the literature as a black marlin. But yeah, there have been a few. Yep.